November 1967. The central highlands of Vietnam lay cloaked in cold rains and thick jungle mist. Amid the rolling terrain near Dak To, a seemingly nameless elevation marked Hill 875 on American military maps was about to become the center of one of the fiercest battles of the entire war. To the U.S. command, it was just a strategic point to seize. But to the North Vietnamese, Hill 875 was a shield, guarding supply routes from the Ho Chi Minh Trail and protecting vital command centers hidden deep within the jungle. Intelligence suggested a major North Vietnamese base beneath the hill's soil, protected by a labyrinth of tunnels and trenches. In response, the U.S. deployed its elite force, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, trained for swift, decisive engagements and armed with superior firepower. It was to be a show of dominance, a quick strike to assert control. Helicopters roared over the canopy, artillery thundered through the valley, and napalm scorched the flanks of the hill. Yet beneath the surface, the defenders remained silent. For weeks, North Vietnamese engineers had dug deep, constructing bunkers reinforced with timber and clay, camouflaged foxholes, and overlapping fields of fire. They didn't flinch under bombardment. They waited till dawn on November 18th. The first American boots touched the muddy slope. The ground was soft, the air heavy, the trees scarred. As soldiers climbed cautiously, the silence broke. Suddenly and all at once, machine guns erupted from hidden nests, RPGs screamed from the jungle's edge, and claymore mines ripped through the underbrush. What had seemed like an empty hill came alive with fire. Radio calls for support filled the air, but chaos ruled. A medevac helicopter was struck and burst into flames, crashing into the ravine below. Men dropped to the ground, pinned by snipers and unable to move. The hill, soaked in monsoon rain just hours before, now ran red with blood. What began as a tactical maneuver became a nightmare. In the opening hours of the battle, Hill 875 earned a new name among American soldiers, the ridge that bled. Nightfall came swiftly to Hill 875. As dusk cloaked the ridgeline, the battlefield transformed. The vibrant chaos of gunfire and movement fell into an uneasy hush, pierced only by the distant rumble of artillery and the sharp chirps of insects reclaiming their forest. The rain had stopped, but the damp chill clung to everything. Clothes, rifles, nerves. The American perimeter. Foxholes were hastily dug into the slope's muddy skin. Soldiers clung to their positions, fingers twitching on triggers, eyes straining in every direction. The jungle was a wall of darkness, thick, breathing, alive. Every rustle might be a patrol, every gust a whisper of death. Conversations were whispered, prayers silent, and hearts beat like distant mortar thuds. Across the ridge, the North Vietnamese army prepared in silence. No lights, no movement above the waist. Orders traveled by hand signals and breathless messengers. These soldiers had learned to become shadows, never revealing, never rushing. Beneath the roots and rocks, they waited, crouched in wet tunnels, weapons dry, minds focused. 2:14 a.m. The hill roared again. A burst of flares lit the canopy in a sudden white blaze, exposing silhouettes creeping up the slope. American M60s opened fire, cutting tracers through the night. RPGs responded in arcs of fire, slamming into sandbags and tree stumps. Shouts echoed, indistinct, swallowed by thunder. Trees cracked, dirt flew, screams rose. But within the chaos, there was strategy. While a decoy assault drew attention from the south, a main NVA unit breached from the north under the cover of terrain and silence. A listening post was overrun in seconds, its defenders barely firing a shot. Panic flared as the line bent. For hours, darkness became war's greatest ally. Guns flared, men vanished. The jungle devoured light and sound alike. On Hill 875, there were no eyes, only instinct, memory, and the desperate will to survive the unseen. By dawn on November 19th, the jungle was no longer silent. Hill 875 trembled under renewed bombardment. The U.S. command, realizing the scale of resistance, launched a full assault. Artillery shells screamed from nearby firebases, exploding into the ridge. The hill coughed smoke and flame with each strike, but deep below, the enemy remained rooted. The 173rd Airborne reorganized into tight platoons, pushing uphill in bounding waves. The line of American troops moved cautiously, 5 steps, drop, 10 seconds, advance. Every bush could conceal death. Behind every rock, an ambush. The enemy had melted into the terrain, and the line that separated assault from survival had all but vanished. Suddenly, the north slope erupted with fire. Dozens of NVA troops emerged from hidden bunkers, unleashing coordinated bursts from AK-47s and PK machine guns. Claymore mines preset by NVA exploded with deadly precision. American formations fractured. Chaos spread like wildfire. One radio unit was cut off, a medic was shot while dragging a wounded man, and squads called for air support amidst smoke and overlapping screams. A miscommunication led to tragedy. 2 American airstrikes, meant to suppress the hilltop bunkers, missed by only meters. Napalm surged down the slope, catching American positions. Fire roared. Men screamed, not from fear, but from burns. Dozens were injured. The chain of command frayed under heat and confusion. Yet within the inferno, soldiers refused to break. They crawled, bled, and returned fire. One sergeant rallied what was left of his squad and charged the next ridge. His face blackened, his uniform torn, but his voice roared louder than the mortars. For every inch of ground, they paid in blood. By late afternoon, they held a portion of the upper slope. But the cost was staggering. Of the companies that began the charge, over half were casualties. The line held, but it was no longer a line. It was a bleeding, battered edge between the living and the dead. The morning of November 20th brought no relief. The hill was soaked in blood and sweat. Its soil churned into a thick, red-brown paste by boots, shrapnel, and the dead. Smoke clung to every tree branch like a mourning shroud. For the soldiers still alive, sleep was a luxury long forgotten. Their eyes were sunken, their uniforms damp, their movements reduced to instinct and memory. Orders came through gritted teeth. Advance again. The survivors of the previous day's assault, some limping, others bandaged, formed up once more. Their numbers were fewer now, their faces older, and their silence heavier. They knew what lay ahead: bunkers fortified by weeks of preparation, hidden machine guns, enemy troops who knew every inch of the hill's flesh. The climb resumed under cover of artillery. Shells from 105mm howitzers landed ahead with teeth-rattling force. But the jungle absorbed them. Roots, rocks, and cunning dugouts reduced the damage. The North Vietnamese were still there, watching, waiting. As Americans approached the final ridge, the earth exploded. Mortars from concealed pits, RPGs from behind smoking trees, and sudden gunfire from spider holes tore into the formation. Men dove for cover where none existed. Some fought from ditches half-filled with rainwater and blood. Others returned fire blindly, praying it mattered. Shouts for medics rose again, answered by only 1 or 2 still standing. Then came the moment of madness, a full frontal push. A young lieutenant, his voice barely audible over the cacophony, led a dozen men uphill. With bayonets fixed and grenades in hand, they charged. Many didn't make it, but some did. They cleared the first bunker with sheer will, the second with fire and steel. The mud turned black with blood. Rifles jammed. Hands bled from shattered rocks. And yet the line moved forward, inch by inch, heart by heart. By dusk, they had reached the base of the hill's final trench line. Night approached again, but this time the hill remembered their names. November 21st, the 5th day. The hill had stopped being a place. It had become a wound, raw and unhealing, pulsing with fire and screams. For those who remained, time no longer passed in hours, but in seconds between mortar blasts, between the last breath of a comrade and the next whispered order. The dead outnumbered the living. Yet the orders remained: hold the line, push forward. The trench line was inches away, so close that American soldiers could hear North Vietnamese voices, whispers echoing from below the roots. from bunkers carved like veins through the hillside. It was a war within the earth now. Neither side yielded. Every meter cost blood. Lieutenant James "Red" Tanner, once a baseball coach back in Ohio, now led what was left of his company. Just 16 men from an original force of over 90. His voice was cracked, his left arm useless from a bullet wound, but he stood at the front. His orders came with no explanation, only faith. "We go. Now." They rose from muddy trenches, weapons clutched to chests, and moved like phantoms through smoke. Grenades flew ahead, bullets danced around them. They screamed names of lost brothers, cursed the hill, cursed the silence that followed each shot. One man died crawling toward a bunker's mouth. Another leapt in and never came out. But one breach was made. A hole in the line. A moment of hope. Then came the counterattack. Dozens of NVA surged from underground like shadows unbound, hurling grenades, firing from hips. American forces were pushed back step by bloody step. A machine gun jammed. A medic ran out of morphine. A flame trooper fell and set fire to the leaves around his own men. There was no way back. By dusk, Tanner stood alone atop the half-destroyed bunker. Blood ran down his side. He raised his rifle and fired one last shot into the darkening sky. Not out of hope, but defiance. Below, silence fell. Hill 875 had not been taken. But it had been marked by names, by fire, by a cost too high to count. The sixth day on Hill 875 dawned without sunlight. Smoke from endless bombardments still curled through the trees like ghosts reluctant to leave the dead behind. What had once been jungle was now a skeletal battlefield. Trees shattered, earth turned inside out, and the stench of blood mixing with the tang of gunpowder. No birds sang. No crickets dared. Only the wind moved, soft, mournful, and heavy with memory. Bodies lay in layers now. American, Vietnamese, indistinguishable beneath mud, soot, and torn uniforms. The medics no longer counted the wounded. They simply looked for signs of breath. Some carried the same wounded up and down the hill 3 times, only to find themselves carrying their corpses back the 4th. Every step was a prayer. Every silence a scream that refused to die. The command post. Maps had become soaked with sweat and rain. Orders changed by the hour. Morale bent like the trees. Burned, broken, barely standing. Lieutenant Tanner's voice was hoarse from shouting over blasts. His eyes sunken from lack of sleep. Yet he stayed on his feet. The men needed someone who refused to fall. A single airstrike was authorized. At noon, jets screamed through the gray sky and dropped canisters of fire. Napalm rolled down the ridge like molten wind. Screams rose not only from the NVA trenches, but from American lines caught in the blast. Friendly fire. Again. When it ended, the hill was even less alive. That night, it rained. Not just droplets, but a steady, heavy downpour, as if the sky itself mourned. Soldiers wrapped ponchos around bodies. Others used helmets to catch rainwater for the living. No one spoke. They simply stared into the fog, rifles in lap, waiting. For what? None could say. Maybe orders. Maybe death. Maybe the silence to end. Night fell like a curtain soaked in blood. The rain had stopped, but the air was still wet. Wet with smoke, with breath, with fear that clung to every man like a second skin. On Hill 875, there was no more battle line. There was only the hill itself, and men scattered across its broken face, trying not to die. The fires had gone out. What little warmth they had offered was now memory. No light meant no movement. No movement meant no target. The jungle, once alive with birds and whispers, now crouched silent. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. Inside one collapsed bunker, Lieutenant Tanner scribbled names into a soggy notebook. Names of the dead. Names of the missing. Names of men who had held rifles with trembling hands and refused to run. His pen barely moved. His eyes didn't blink. Around him, a few soldiers sat with heads bowed, mumbling to ghosts, or to no one. Somewhere on the eastern slope, a flare went up, red and dying fast. Its brief light revealed bodies tangled in vines, rifles buried halfway into mud, and a foxhole filled with rain and blood. Then it vanished, leaving only darkness and the command post below. Static hissed from broken radios. No new orders came. The hill was a forgotten island, cut off by weather, by enemy fire, and by the sheer impossibility of retreat. Resupply had failed. Air cover had shifted elsewhere. All that remained was survival and silence. Until it wasn't. At 2 a.m., the night erupted, rifle cracks, shouted orders, and a wave of enemy fire. North Vietnamese forces, hidden all day, struck from both flanks. They carried knives and grenades. They fought hand to hand. A flamethrower was ignited too late, scorching trees instead of foes. Screams tore through the dark, but no one could see who lived or died. When the clash faded, silence returned, heavier than before. By dawn, the hill smelled only of burnt metal, wet ash, and blood. They called it the night of the lost fire, because after that, even the flames were afraid to rise. By the 8th day, the trenches had taken on a life of their own. They no longer felt like shelter. They were veins beneath a dying giant, narrow, claustrophobic, soaked with water and death. Every wall bore the scrape of boots, the imprint of bleeding hands. The men who walked them moved like phantoms, silent, gaunt, uncertain if they were alive or just not dead yet. The enemy was always near. The jungle above had gone still. The birds had fled. The insects had fallen silent. Even the wind had forgotten how to move. Every sound, every shuffle, every cough, echoed like thunder in those shallow, grave-like tunnels. No one dared speak above a whisper. No one laughed. No one cried. Those were luxuries now reserved for ghosts. Lieutenant Tanner's company was down to 9. 9 out of 92. Their names were known only to each other now, forgotten by command, buried beneath missed transmissions and the noise of larger fronts. The hill had consumed them, and still demanded more. At midday, Tanner led a patrol down one of the abandoned Vietnamese trenches. The walls were scorched black, bones visible in the dirt, rifles rusting in corners. But something moved. A glint, a breath, a shadow. They halted, rifles raised. Nothing, then a figure appeared. A North Vietnamese soldier, unarmed, hands lifted, eyes sunken and hollow. He was a boy, 17, maybe 16. He spoke no English and none of them spoke Vietnamese. He just stood there, waiting, silent. Tanner stared at him. No one moved. Then the boy knelt and wept. The patrol moved past him. Rifles lowered. War had bent even hate into exhaustion. That night, the trenches were lit by the flicker of a single flare, floating down like a dying star. Its light revealed the faces of soldiers who no longer dreamed of victory, only sleep. Among them, the ghosts watched, some with uniforms, others with eyes. And all of them waited. The 9th day began with a sound no one had heard in hours. Boots rushing through the mud, shouted orders with urgency instead of despair. Reinforcements were coming. Not many, but enough to remind the survivors that they were not forgotten. 2 helicopters punched through the smoke-choked sky and dropped supplies. Ammo, morphine, water. Then came the gunships, hammering the northern ridge with rockets that shook the bones of the mountain itself. For a moment, the men in the trenches lifted their heads and remembered they were still alive. Lieutenant Tanner stood atop the trench wall, his voice ragged but rising above the chaos. He pointed, directed, screamed over the roar of machine guns and air support. His men followed him, not out of belief in orders, but because they had no one else. At midday, the North Vietnamese launched a final assault. Waves of shadows surged through the jungle, rifles raised, bayonets flashing in the light of burning trees. The air turned to fire and dirt. Screams came from every direction. Some men fought from muscle memory, others from pure will. Tanner took a bullet in the shoulder but stayed standing. Blood soaked his shirt, his left arm hung limp, but he refused to fall. He kept shouting. The hill didn't shake. It groaned. Like something ancient and sacred was cracking. By sundown, the last enemy had retreated. Not because they were defeated, but because there was nothing left to kill. The dead outnumbered the living. The hill was ash. Tanner collapsed near the command post, breathing in short, ragged gasps. A medic wrapped his arm. He didn't speak. He just stared up at the sky. "I thought we were going to die here," one soldier whispered. Tanner didn't answer. He had already heard that voice too many times in dreams. That night, the survivors huddled in silence. They had held the hill. But no one could say what had been won. Only what had been lost. They called it a victory. Official reports praised the courage of the troops, the strategic significance of Hill 875, the successful repelling of enemy forces. Medals were issued. Names were read aloud at ceremonies far from the jungle. Flags were folded. Speeches were given. But the survivors remembered something different. They remembered the smell of scorched skin and wet metal, the endless screaming, the sound of boots squelching through mud layered with ash and blood, the days without sleep, the nights without stars, and the silence that crept in between bullets like a second war. Lieutenant Tanner was airlifted out 3 days after the last shot. His arm was saved. His voice never returned to full strength. He spent the rest of the war behind a desk, organizing maps and casualty reports. His body healed. His soul stayed on that hill. Others fared worse. Some never spoke again. Some didn't return home at all, alive, but unreachable. One soldier jumped at the sound of thunder for the next 20 years. Another carried a letter in his pocket he never mailed. The hill had branded them, stitched itself into their memories like a name burned onto flesh in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese buried their dead in silence.
No headlines. No medals.
Just fathers, sons, and brothers who never came back. The jungle regrew, trees rising from the craters, vines swallowing the trenches. But the earth never forgot. Rain still tasted of smoke. Years later, someone placed a small wooden cross at the summit. No name, no flag, just a scrap of cloth tied around it, red, faded, and frayed. Beneath it were 3 dog tags, rusted nearly beyond reading. They belonged to both sides. After the hill, time moved forward. But for those who fought there, part of them never did.